I've been noticing this inherent tension in the timelines of science solutions in Santa Cruz. You see, because some of these environmental solutions we're talking about take decades to unfold. Meanwhile, there are 50-year visioning plans, and there are problems we've been trying to solve for like 50 years. Meanwhile, our election cycles are 4 years long, and our budget cycles are 2 years long. So what does effective leadership look like when you have this mismatch of timelines? And I think that Senator John Laird, who represents our district, the 17th district in California, is an example of that kind of leadership. A decades-long, relentless focus on an outcome that is really important to a community. You see, John Laird was a student at UCSC in the 70s. He was on city council, and he served as mayor. He was a California assembly person, the Secretary of Natural Resources for 8 years, and now he's in his final term as a California state senator, and he has been relentlessly dedicated to solving some of these big environmental problems. So in today's episode of Science Solutions Santa Cruz, Senator Laird and I sit down to have a career-spanning conversation. We touch on things like water and the Pajaro River Levee and the Ocean Protection Council, and how science leads to solutions on this decade-long scale and more. I'm Jonathan Hicken. Enjoy. Welcome to the studio. I have John Laird with me today. He's the California State Senator of the 17th District. And he's done a couple of other things before that, but welcome to the studio, John.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So you came to Santa Cruz in the 70s as a student, if I'm not mistaken.
Late 60s, actually.
Late 60s,
I was
okay.
in the fourth class. I was 68 to 72, and the first class hadn't graduated when I got here.
No kidding. Okay, so you're one of the original slugs.
There were just over 2,000 students when I arrived, and Merrill College opened as... It's funny, I had one friend from high school who came to UCSC at the same time, and she was a student at Merrill College, and they were constructing it. And so they sent a note saying it might not be done. You might have to live in tents for 2 weeks before you can get into the dorms. So that's sort of what it was like there at the beginning.
And now here we are building tons of new student housing. I'm really excited for that to come about. And then fast forwarding a little ways, you stuck around in Santa Cruz, and then you joined the city council and served as mayor at some point. That was in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and I actually left for 2 years after graduation, but I worked for a member of Congress, and it was really helpful because it gave me a chance to come back and get a job that I wouldn't have gotten if I had because I got a job for the county administrator. And it's funny because the congressman I worked for, it was an exciting time. He was on the House Judiciary Committee while they were impeaching Nixon. But he was also running against Jerry Brown for governor in the primary. And when I got interviewed by Jerry Brown for the cabinet, I thought, oh, how's this going to go? And he sees it on the resume. One of the first things, and he says, well, he was one of the last people with integrity to run for governor of California. He didn't poll the people in the middle to know what he thought. And I thought, well, that's almost as much a statement about Jerry Brown as it was about Jerry Walde, who was the person I was working for.
So was it your intention to come back to Santa Cruz when you left?
It was I would like to. Yeah, okay. I thought at the time, and because I was still working in California most of the time, I would come for weekends, and it was such a special place. Yeah. And that was before there was much development.
Sure.
I remember visiting a friend and who was living on Mission Street, and we just sat out on the curb, and a car came by about every 5 minutes, and it's just like
very different than today.
Another time and place.
And I'm wondering, if I'm not mistaken, in the time on your city council here, you were part of the Blue Wall 1.0 initiative, if you will, and I wonder, when you were on city council, was it that effort or another sort of environmental effort where you sort of deeply understood how environmental policy and how environmental progress happened?
Well, yes, but there's two pieces to that question. One is that in the 80s, the Santa Cruz city elections were in odd years. We were not synchronized with the governor's race or the presidential race. So when I was elected in 1981, there was nothing else on the ballot except, I think, a Cabrillo trustee election. And so we developed this technique of trying to have ballot measures to get out the vote. So the two, it's very funny, the two, when I was running in 1981, were domestic violence protocols for the police and a non-intervention in El Salvador. And our turnout was 58% with nothing else on the ballot.
That was it.
Yeah, and so I think in 83 we did anti-apartheid. But when 85 approached and I was running for re-election and my colleague Marty Wormhout was running for re-election, I approached local environmentalists and said, I'd like to do a ballot measure against offshore oil drilling. And they responded. I always remember Kim Shantz in particular, who was active with Save Our Shores at the time, says, well, it has to have teeth. And we're like, we're city. This is a federal thing with state being involved. How can we have teeth? And with the help of Supervisor Gary Patton and other people at the time, we came up with the thought that the one constitutional thing that goes to cities and counties is the right to zone. And we would have a provision that said you can't have a zoning change for onshore support facilities for drilling without a vote of the people. And it meant that electeds couldn't sort of sell out to the oil companies. The people had to be involved. It was a city and a county right. And at the same time, it wasn't an absolute ban, which probably wouldn't have passed a court test. So that passed with over 80% in Santa Cruz. And there was a provision that said you could use city money to educate other cities and counties on how to do this. So we hired Save Our Shores, and Dan Hafley was the executive director at the time. And by the time we were done in 1990, I think there were 26 cities and counties up and down the California coast that had adopted those ordinances, which became what you referred to as the Blue Wall. And except for Santa Barbara, which I think adopted it and had a 25-year sunset, all the rest are still on the books. So as we head into the current fight, those are all there. So that was a big deal, and I ended up working with Dan for 5 years on that. And you fast forward, I'm Secretary of Resources in 2017 when, of all things, Trump wants to do it again. And so I suddenly become California's point person against offshore oil drilling. And Dan and I, one morning, were on All Things Considered with NPR, and they interviewed us, and they said, you did this back in the 80s, and here you are now, and you're in different positions, but you're still involved in this. And we really talked about the fight and how it is. But the other part of your question was sort of, how did you sort of get involved in environmental stuff?
Yeah, what did this teach you?
There were some things before that. It was a whole mix of things, and I think part of it is my parents were both from the Midwest, and they arrived in California months before I arrived on the scene, and they did not have experience with oceans. They didn't have experiences with the mountains, and so we spent a lot of time as a kid at the oceans and a lot of time in the Sierra. My parents just thought it was an amazing opportunity, and there was this one moment where my dad was a high school teacher, and his best friend, or one of his best friends, was the biology teacher. And so we arranged one weekend morning when the tides were right. He drove my whole family over to somewhere in Marin or Sonoma, and we did a complete tide pools watch. And I don't know, I was 9 or 10, and it was powerful. It was just powerful, and it let you know what was out there and what the issues were. And as you read more, you understood some of the stresses. And then when I was at UCSC, I was a politics major. And when you got to be a senior, you had your choice of one of two things. You could have your professors bark theory questions at you for 2 or 3 hours in comprehensive examinations. Or you could write an undergraduate thesis. Well, that was not a choice for me. They weren't going to bark theory questions at me for 2 or 3 hours. So I did an undergraduate thesis on the history of water development in California. And it turns out I have never been far from the water issue ever. And it is inextricably tied to oceans and climate and all the other issues. And it's funny because I have given commencement speeches now, I think, over the years at 6 of the 10 UCSC colleges, and I always have a little riff of sections of advice. And one is that I did that thesis, and I thought that, water policy in California is driven by Central Valley agriculture, urban Southern California. I'm a bit of an enviro from the coast. I will never be involved in water policy. And then lo and behold, for 8 years, I'm the governor's point person on water in the state. And
full circle.
Yeah, the first message is pay attention to what you're studying. You might be in charge of it someday. But it really meant that you can't do that the doors can open and you can use that. And it was really exciting because it was just, I wasn't an outsider, and you could bring a lot of these issues to bear.
Speaking of water, I think one of those sort of fun little facts about Santa Cruz County is that we're totally 100% water independent, right? We don't import or export water. Are you still in your role in the state Senate? Are you still active in local water issues?
Very much.
And so what do you...
And I have to tell you that is not unique, because that's also true with Monterey County, which is wholly in my district.
Okay.
And it's also true with parts of San Benito and San Luis Obispo, which are also in my district.
Okay.
And it comes up. There was this time, it's actually now in retrospect a funny story, but in the moment it was taxing. And that's that I'm in this small meeting with Dianne Feinstein and one of her assistants and Jerry Brown, and he brought one other person, and we were talking about the water bond in 2014. And it was funny off the top to let you know behind the scenes what happens, because I said to the governor's chief of staff, I said, I'm not 100% up to date on where he is on the water bond. And they said, don't worry, he's totally up to speed. And then I get there, and he's stuck in traffic on the Bay Bridge. And Dianne Feinstein says, let's start. And I'm like, oh, no.
What are we doing?
Yeah, and there's a point at which she wants the entire water bond to just be about the Delta. And if you get water off the Delta. And I said to her, 1/3 of Californians don't get water from the Delta, and they will be voting on this bond. And she sort of barks at me like, who are those people? So I'm like, okay, Sierra Foothills, far north, Cascades, coastal California in certain places, my home in the Central Coast. And I move her a little, and then Jerry Brown shows up, and we have to have the same conversation all over again. I have to say the same thing again. And he turns to me and says, who are those people? And I think, I am in a special place in hell right now.
So how did that play out?
It played out that we had different pots that everybody could be eligible for.
Okay.
Water recycling, which the Pajaro Valley has done. Yeah. And when you look at oceans, everybody thinks water recycling is totally about water supply. Mm-hmm. But in the warm months now, for the last 5 or 6 years, no sewage from the Pajaro Valley has gone into the Monterey Bay.
Wow.
Because they are completely recycling. It's not, in the winter, there's such flows that it's not totally true. But in the warm, it is. And so everybody thinks that's about water supply. But that's actually, there were studies done, and there's a guy at UCSC, Rafe Cadella.
Yeah.
And he, when I was secretary, he came in, and I used to always say with ocean acidification, it's really the carbon sink, but it's also nitrates near shore. And he at one point said, no, I have to correct you because we're doing a lot of work, and the dumping of treated wastewater is also near shore, a fundamental contributor to acidification. And so when we, through the water measure, ironically, there was one pot in that water bond that I think was $860 million for water recycling, and it was the first pot that was fully subscribed. And And if you look up and down the coast, I mean, the classic one in the other part of my district is Morro Bay. And they had this old plant that was always at risk of failing, that was right on the ocean, and it was a long, arduous process. Local voters were unhappy at different times. But they did a water recycling plant that's inland from Morro Bay, a mile or two. And it went online 3 weeks before the atmospheric rivers hit in 2023. And if it had not been online, there would have been a catastrophic failure of the old plant into the ocean.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and so the fact that there was this recycling really made a difference in ocean health. And so like we spend time in Mendocino, and they're just always running out of water, and yet they're not doing recycling. And it's one of those things that is a common source for everyone, but it's also, and people don't look at it this way, it's also an ocean health measure.
Yeah, it sure is. Speaking of water, I wasn't expecting we would go here, but it makes me think the atmospheric river in 2023 and flooding, it makes me think of the Pajaro River.
Yes.
And that was a levee that needed repairs for a really long time. And I know that you're working on that particular levee at the moment.
Well, it's an interesting story because you're exactly right. When I was sworn into the Senate in 2020, it was said that they had anywhere from a 3 to 7 year window to not flood. And so I did a bill, and Robert Rivas wasn't speaker yet. He co-authored it with me in the Assembly, that they couldn't move ahead in some ways for a project because the tax base or the rate base in the Pajaro Valley is disadvantaged, and they couldn't spread the costs enough to afford the levee project. So I did a bill that allowed the state, for the first time ever, to buy out the local share for a levee project.
Ooh, unpack that for us. What is that? What's the implication of that?
The implication is that if it's done the way it's always been done to fund a levee project, you have a set of federal monies, state monies, and local monies. And they just couldn't afford the local share for the levies. So the state assumed it. And then we were able to fund with just federal and state monies, but the locals then went to the voters to be able to maintain the levies and passed it because they didn't have this excessive burden for the local share. So the October before the levee break, we all stood on the levee. Senator Alex Padilla was there. Zoe Lofgren and Jimmy Panetta were there. I was there. Robert Rivas was there. And we celebrated a fully funded levee project, and then we couldn't get there. The levee broke before the project could start.
How did that feel when you saw the news break that the levee had broke?
Well, I'll never forget it because I got a text. I think it was first thing in the morning, one morning, from Carlos Palacios, who was the county administrator, saying, breach in the levee at the Pajaro at sometime in the middle of the night. And I just knew, here we go. And in that one, there's a couple of interesting behind-the-scenes stories. Everything that's out there was a tragic a part of the story and what happened to the people in Pajaro. And there's where I learned another thing. I think I was on All Things Considered at, oh my God, it was 4 a.m. California time. And I learned that NPR doesn't trust you. So NPR did a wake-up call to me, at 3:15 or something to say, you're on in 45 minutes. Are you up? I've never had that experience before. And yet it was interesting because Tina Nieto was the brand new sheriff of Monterey County. And in the lead-in, they have her voice saying, get out, just get out. And then it cuts to me. And I said, here are people just sleeping in their homes. And suddenly the sirens go off and they just grab whatever they can grab on the way out the door. And that's the way it happened. And an incredible tragedy. And then there was this point that when the water broke into Pajaro, it went about 3 miles down to Highway 1. And Highway 1 is raised, it's elevated, it's 20 or 25 feet above the level of the fields, and the levee is right there. And that was serving as a dam. So it was coming around, and there was a point at which there is a little pipe for drainage, but it's
not big enough for that.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be maintained and not big enough for that. And so for a few hours, they were seriously considering blowing up 100 or 200 yards of Highway 1 and letting the water through. And they spent frantically the night before putting rocks around the treatment plant that was below Highway 1 that serves Watsonville and the Pajaro Valley to try to arm it in case the water came through. If you look at government stuff, like I said to people, I said, do people in Sacramento know this? Does the governor know this? Does the head of we're going to elevate it, they said. And I thought, Jesus, we're going to elevate it. So in the next hour, I talked to the director of emergency services, and she said, this is the first I've heard of it. And I talked to the governor's chief of staff, who said, this is the first I've heard of it.
Being the blowing up
possibility of taking out part of Highway 1. And so we were lucky for two reasons. One is it stopped raining for a little while. And the second thing is that there was a small leak in either the levee or the road, and it started to drain it lightly. And so in the end, that wasn't necessary. But it was interesting telling each of these people as they move in their current jobs, and they just looked at me like, you're kidding.
You got to be kidding. Yeah.
Those are the things that happen when you're in the middle
of
an
moment.
Emergency.
So going back to this sort of state level buyout of the local stake, is this a bill? Is this something that you're institutionalizing? And what are the broader implications? Like, what could communities do differently if that passes than they can do today?
Well, first, that was really an exception to the universe.
Okay.
That had never really happened in California before. Okay. And we were able to do it. Lo and behold, I'm negotiating this in part with the director of water resources as a state senator, but I appointed her with the governor. so I was very close to her. And to her credit, she got to the right place without us having to do anything. And the way it worked was fascinating, which is there's special grants for cities or communities if they're disadvantaged. Mm-hmm. And yet they were getting these extra grants, but they were capped out because it was just, the shares were clearly defined. And so my bill basically said you can go up to 100% with the state grants. And in negotiating it with the Department of Water Resources, they were worried that would be declared a precedent for wealthier communities that could afford it, as opposed to what the situation was in the Pajaro Valley. So I amended the bill to give the director of the Department of Water Resources the authority to approve it. And then they said, okay, we have the backstop. We know we're going to approve this one. But if some very wealthy community comes, we have the tools to not say this is a precedent, and you get paid in the same way.
If you haven't visited the Seymour Marine Discovery Center at UC Santa Cruz in a while, or ever, you really should come visit us. We are right on the bluffs of the beautiful Monterey Bay, with an aquarium full of local species and a bunch of hands-on science exhibits that help you understand what's happening in our ocean and along our coast. We are connecting the incredible research happening at UC Santa Cruz with real-world solutions for our coastal community. We don't want science to just sit on a shelf. We want it to shape decisions, inspire kids, and help our community feel equipped to act. So if you care about the future of our ocean and our coastal community, or you just want to experience a place that makes you feel a little more connected to it, come visit us at the Seymour Marine Discovery Center. Science Solutions, Santa Cruz. Does this allow communities to, I'm using Pajaro as the example here, or the reference point. Would this allow communities to implement sort of climate or environmental related projects more quickly, or with fewer local funds dedicated? I'm just trying to unpack, what does this mean for us?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because the project itself, very environmentally sensitive. There's places that it helps restore wetlands. There's one place where some of the stuff is within the levee. It's not outside, which which is wetlands. And so you hope that a project will do that without you having to do an overlay to it. But then at the same time, the very fact that you have to do the project is because of the changing climate.
Right.
And that's the tough thing is there's a guy that was originally local, went to Mount Madonna High School and was a grad student and professor at UCSC that's now at Stanford, Noah Diffenbaugh. And he said once, and I really relied on him when I was secretary, because he could translate things. It wasn't, with all due respect to all my friends that are scientists, it wasn't in scientese. It wasn't like there's 5 caveats, just all this stuff. He would say, basically, our water infrastructure was designed in one climate, and now we are in another climate with a water infrastructure that wasn't designed for this climate. So we have to take that into account in any project we do. And it's Governor Brown and now Governor Newsom involved in very controversial stuff in the Delta. But what's happened is now our entire water system, the Sierra snowpack, is shrinking. So our entire water system depends on whether there's 8 or 10 big storms a year and whether you can capture excess water from those storms. And it's really about making sure that you don't divert necessary flows out of the Delta, flows for fish and other things, but have the ability to capture the excess water. And you know, there was a LA Times columnist that once referred to the Delta as pristine. And I was sort of like, you have not looked at the definition of pristine lately. It is really unaffected in its natural state. The Delta is bucolic, but it's one of the most engineered places in the universe. It's when Europeans came to California, it had 500,000 acres of wetlands. When we started the Brown administration, it was down to 30,000. So our job was in part to try to restore some of the historic wetlands in the Delta at the same time that you're trying to figure out the water supply, which is very controversial. And 1 foot of sea level rise would change a flood in the Delta from a 100-year flood to a 10-year flood. And those levees, if they go, it sucks salt water in from the San Francisco Bay. So suddenly, and it's peat in the soil, a certain mix, farmland, suddenly you have salt on that. And it sort of destroys it. And what people don't realize in general is that it takes a minimum amount of flows through the Delta to keep the salt in the San Francisco Bay. And before the federal water project was done in the 1930s, just before, there was this huge drought, and salt water went all the way into Stockton. I mean, it just went that far up because there was nothing pushing it back into the bay. And so that makes it really hard. And we really, I definitely am worried about the salmon fishery and want to make sure that continues and that you have all the right conditions. And that's the tough thing. I was speaking to one Western growers group when I was secretary, and they said, well, if there's 1 extra acre foot of water that goes into the bay, we failed. And it's like, you don't seem to understand. There's fish that depend on this. You have to keep the salt there. This isn't just about how much you can divert for agriculture, even though the water project supplies water to 3 million acres of irrigated agriculture in California, and that's really important.
There's a similar dynamic here, I understand, the kind of the saltwater, freshwater dynamic, where if we are sort of extracting too much freshwater out of our groundwater supply, that causes the saltwater from the ocean to sort of like leach into the groundwater in a way that makes the wells that agricultural operations in our region are using, and makes that water brackish and no longer usable for agriculture.
Well, one of the places that it's true in the Central County with the SoCal Creek Water District, but when we were talking about the water recycling in the Pajaro Valley, it's the Pajaro Valley when it shifted from dry farming apples to specialty crops that are much more water intensive. the overdrafting was more severe, and there is seawater intrusion in from the coast. And so the interesting thing is the water recycling plant. There's Kitayama Brothers, and that's a whole nother thing. There were all these flower growers in the Pajaro Valley, and in the 80s or 90s sometime, they changed the tariffs. They lowered them to try to encourage Colombian flower growers so people would stop growing coca, and it drove the flower businesses in the Pajaro Valley out of business. There were just 3 or 5 of 75 left. And so the Kitayama Brothers are overdrafted. They're off of San Andreas Road. They're overdrafted land. Well, it turns out the water recycling is how they get their water. So the water recycling is not just doing more water supply, not just protecting the bay, but it is the lifeline to the people that are over seawater intrusion.
We were talking, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking back that like the time scale of the issues that we're talking about, kind of going back to the Cubs metaphor here. But, you know, I think a lot about these different time scales. I mean, we've talked about things that happened 50 years ago, and we're talking about issues that'll impact this county 50 years from now and beyond. And so I sometimes wonder about the sort of the budget cycle and election cycle and how democratic processes work, which are on these like 2, 4, 8-year cycles. But we're talking about problems that happen over the course of decades. So how do you think about bridging those two timescales?
Well, the election cycles and the budget cycles don't match. And there's always a desire for short-term gratification, and there's not a reward for long-term planning. And in a related thing that isn't water, I really worked when I was in the assembly on green buildings, more efficient buildings. Well, at the time, they've gotten much better. But at the time, you would have to do an upfront investment that might be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% more than the annual cost of the building to be able to make it green. And the green eye shade people would say, no, we want the cheapest thing. But then they weren't factoring into the fact that the ongoing costs, because it was more efficient, were going to be much lower over the 30 or 40 or 50-year life of a building. So the budget system didn't incent something that actually was savings over the long term. And that's the problem, is there has to be incentives for doing the right thing for the long term, because now with term limits, you can't even be in the legislature longer than 12 years, and you can't see a project all the way through in a way that you really need to for long term. It's funny because there's this assembly member I've gotten to know who's in his first term, and he said to me, I don't get it. We're limited here in time. You seem to have been here forever. How did you do this? And I said, assembly, I was on the waste board, I was secretary. In the end, interestingly, when I am termed out in 2.5 years, I will have had 2 25-year careers. I will have had a 25-year career in local government and local affairs in Santa Cruz, and a 25-year career in state government at the state level. And a lot of people don't have that option. And now, I mean, Mark Stone left after 10 years. Gail's limited to 12. Unless you go into some position in the administration, there's not much of a chance to be there for very long when you have some of these long-term issues that really need addressing.
So that's fascinating. I didn't put those pieces together, that you had the 25-25. How does that perspective factor into the last 2.5 years you have left? Like, how does that impact the way you're thinking about your work, even sort of folding in this timescale discussion?
Well, I have a lot of things I'm trying to do before we're gone, and it's funny. I can't believe we're headed toward a change in administration, that it was 8 years ago right now that I was trying to do all these things before we headed out the door. I ended up being the only cabinet secretary that went first day to last day with Jerry Brown, and I kept thinking I'd leave. It's a meat grinder thing. But when we had a couple of years out, it's like, no, we have to get Tahoe saved. We have to get the marine protected areas locked in. We have to do stuff in water. We were just working to the last minute. And now I'm in a similar position in the legislature, and I have really taken a lead in land conservation And so I just negotiated 6 months ago protecting 8,000 of the 12,000 acres around the Diablo Canyon power plant.
There we go.
And we want to get the other 4. And there's a trail being built between Morro Bay and Cayucos. The Hearst Ranch shows us 20 miles of trail on the Hearst easement, not far from Hearst Castle. And then I negotiated, when I was first back in the Senate, a peace treaty between the residents of Big Sur and the Coastal Commission and Coastal Conservancy, and we have a footprint for 70 miles of coastal trail. And the Coastal Conservancy just approved a grant to start the first 5 miles. And I want to get as much of that in place and rolling before I'm gone. And then similarly, I did the bill, I've lost track, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, to officially do sea level rise planning with all the local governments along the coast. And whenever their coastal plan comes up for review, they have to have a section on sea level rise planning. And I was doing it the year of the atmospheric rivers. And I remember in one committee hearing describing what happened in Pajaro and what was happening at West Cliff Drive and what was happening in Pismo Beach with things falling in. And I basically said, it's really good to have this conversation before the storms, not after. And the Republican leader was sitting in the committee, and he just started laughing. And I said that. I always remember that. And now, as we tape this, the budget's about to be go into print the day that we're taping this. And I am fighting to get the positions back for the Coastal Commission to be able to implement the sea level rise planning thing, because the governor wanted to yank those positions, and I am trying to get them back in the budget. There are a few decisions that will be bucked to August that we won't quite have done in the budget right now, but that's one that I'm working on.
What are the implications of that happening or not happening based on the governor's decision here?
Well, if we don't have those positions at the Coastal Commission, they don't have the ability to work with local governments on their sea level rise planning, and we really need that.
So you kind of kneecap these local jurisdictions from doing the work.
Yes.
That law says they have to do.
Yes, exactly. And we have worked hard to fund local governments in their local coastal plans and worked hard to do it. And a lot of local governments don't have the background or the skill, and you want to be able to have technical assistance. You want to be able to help them with other places that have done it and try to get there. And there's also this thing at the local level where they say, well, how much is the state going to pay to do all the resilience? And it's sort of like, you don't seem to understand. That's unlikely. We will probably pay a chunk of it, but this is going to be billions of dollars. And some of it, I mean, there's all these water treatment plants that are at sea level, and there's all these people that live right up to the ocean. And where we are now here at the Seymour Center, if you just walked out of here during the high seas of the storms, you just think this is a runaway ocean. There's just nothing in the way. And if you went up and down my district, of course, you had the Pajaro, you had the cement ship, the last of it go. You had the seawall there washed out completely. You had water into Capitola Village. And this is more likely going to be something that happens regularly in the future.
And therefore, the need for these positions that are going to help these local jurisdictions succeed. And I got to take a moment to shout out Dr. Tiffany Wise West in the city of Santa Cruz. She came on the show, and she shared that they were like 8 years ahead of the deadline for doing some of this work. So I got to shout out Santa Cruz for doing the good work.
That's great. And I used to tell the story, and now it all runs together, so you don't know. When I was first on the city council, and I was elected to the city council 45 years ago this coming November, we had to approve the design of Lighthouse Field. And there was a desire in the plan to move the road back from the coast in some places.
That sounds familiar.
And we really alienated a key Santa Cruz constituency. The surfers were pretty mad. They were going to have to go more, but there's some places where we ended up moving the road back, and there's some places that it's eroded to where the road has been, where it was moved back 45 years later.
Yeah.
And it's, not all of us get a chance to see in our lifetime the impacts of the work, but you see what is happening with the changing oceans and sea level rise with that.
One of the many ways you've had an impact on this region is your role in the Ocean Protection Council, kind of talking about these timescales. What's really interesting to me, and a theme that keeps recurring on this show, is that these long-term monitoring programs where there's real science and year-over-year data, that those can be really powerful tools for allowing all of us in the state, but also here in Santa Cruz, make really smart decisions about these projects we might need to undertake. So tell us about how your role in the Ocean Protection Council and the impact that you think it has had in these kinds of issues.
Well, I chaired it for 8 years, and actually it met right here at Seymour Center. I think one of the last times I was secretary, and I thought, this is unbelievable. Usually I have to travel all over the state to meet with people. I just had to get in my car and drive for 5 minutes, and here everybody was in my hometown. It was
not a bad
wonderful
venue,
thing. Yeah, it was great, and they're all surprised sometimes because they don't appreciate what we have here completely. There's a number of different ways. When I started at the Ocean Protection Council, they were in the middle of a strategic plan, which sometimes now is a recipe for me to jump off the top of a building. And the strategic plan, you can sort of do it two ways in government. You can use it as a way that you buy in the stakeholders and you have a discussion and you're really making some decisions while you're doing it. Or you can just assemble a laundry list of anything everybody wants, and here's the strategic plan. And that's where it was going. And I realized I could not intercept this. And so finally, I just resigned myself because it had no money attached to anything. It had no priorities. And so I let it go to the end and then announced I was going to be recommending the priorities. And we really divided it into four things, if I can remember what they were. There was marine debris. There was ocean acidification. There was the fisheries and marine protected areas. There was a fourth thing, and we made those our priorities and focused on them. And it was a key time for the marine protected areas. We actually had to designate the last counties. It was Mendocino, Humboldt, and Del Norte. And we had to negotiate a compromise. And the tribes, amazingly, the tribes were opposed to marine protection. They really felt like it inhibited their historic rights. So the first months I was secretary, I negotiated with the tribes until finally we reached what I think is a historic agreement that in the conservation areas, not the absolute no-take areas, if they can demonstrate a historic take for subsistence purposes or ceremonial purposes, they could take it. And it moved the tribes from opposition to support in marine protected areas. And I thought, oh, geez, they were supposed to demonstrate that they had done these historic takes. And I thought, this is going to be really hard. And the tribes were like, no, we've been waiting for you to ask. We have been doing this for generations. It's part of our tradition. We have a history. We can show it to you. And it made the whole thing work. Jerry Brown was such a cheapskate that you could never travel outside the country. And he allowed me to go to the International Wilderness Conference in Salamanca, Spain, and lead a delegation of indigenous people to explain how we'd done it in California and how other places might do it. And so the Ocean Protection Council was a wonderful vehicle to sort of do good policy and bring people together in it. I really appreciate it as an organization. And it was designed out of the Pew Oceans report. And it was designed to sort of focus all the different departments together. And on the marine protected areas, that was just a monumental struggle. And there was private philanthropy that really made a difference. Foundations, Packard, many others came in through Resources Legacy. And there was even, we were confirming this week the director of Fish and Wildlife, and I met with her beforehand, and I was telling her the story. That philanthropy bought all the marine game wardens, now they're wildlife officers, iPads, because they could not link into the system. And if they're getting somebody in a marine protected area that's poaching, they can immediately go online and find out if they have a record, if they've done it before, if they did it like 30 miles up the coast, and it allows them to enforce much better. That was both technology using it in a new and good way, but it was funded by private philanthropy. It wasn't the state that bought those iPads. And so there's been a lot of work done to bring lots of people together on marine protection.
Two last questions before I let you go today, John. And one is back to these kind of the last 2 years of your term before you term out. What can families or people who live in Santa Cruz expect for you to be working on that might impact life in this county?
Oh, there's a lot. And it is really, when you look at the changing climate, we have all the coastal work to do. And we really are going to have to deal with ocean acidification over time and its impacts. And with the current El Nino coming, when a similar thing happened in 2017 in some of the North Coast counties, Mendocino, Sonoma, shellfish the waters had heated so much and the oxygen levels had changed that shellfish were just dying in place. And we could be going into that again. And so the question is what can we do in prevention or long-term policies? And here's the tension you identified earlier between short-term and long-term. The ocean is over 70% of the surface of the earth, and it has absorbed carbon at dangerous levels. But if it hadn't absorbed carbon, climate change in general would be at such a worse level. But now it's topping out. So we have a lot to do there. And then onshore, as you mentioned earlier, we don't import water. And so we really have to look at better efficiencies, different ways to cooperate. Some of the smaller districts are merging. And we also, the CCU fire was a horrible omen, and we run the risk of those kind of fires in other places in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And we are just going to be appropriating additional money for fuels management and fire prevention that needs to go to the locals and do that. And so you just look at a changing climate, and it's fire and water and oceans and a lot of the things that go with that. And I feel like I'm in a unique position. This year I have it's not a light budget, I have 18 bills, but my major things I'm doing are through the budget. But
that's the lever that you're pulling primarily right now.
Yes.
Right.
And we're able, despite some challenges with the budget, to do some good things. And so together with some of the land conservation work, I'm just trying to get a lot done before I'm gone, because I feel like I'm connected in a way that maybe my successor might not be.
Sure. So I just turned 40 in May, and
you're a kid,
and I've got a 6-year-old, and so you just named 3 pretty major problems that we in this region need to confront. So when you're in front of people like me, parents of young children who are trying to build a life here and trying to envision their kids' lives here, what do you tell them that makes them build hope that this can be their family's home for a long time?
Well, first, if the kids aren't listening, I tell the parents having a kid these days is an article of faith.
I'll tell you that.
It really is. And I have a great nephew that just turned 2, and his father works for the water board, and his mother works for the Department of Health. And they both know that we'll have to work to have a life for that kid and not have such a change in climate that really threatens their basic existence. But at the same time, there's so much to do, and we have been successful. I mean, if you look at the Pajaro Valley, whether they recycle water, or Andy Fisher has this professor at UCS.
Yeah, he came on the show. Yeah.
Yeah, he has this it's no longer a pilot project, but instead of just having these 3 industrial-sized recharge projects in the Pajaro Valley to deal with their overdrafting, that there's incentives for individual farmers to do a little piece of each of their land to do recharge in a way that's very good. And as I said earlier, we're doing all these things with trails. There's so much to work on, and there's so much to work on that will make a difference. And behind it all is making sure the public knows what's going on.
Yeah.
That's the tough thing, and trying to explain it in English.
That's why we're doing this show, John, is to be able to do exactly that. Yeah, the thing that strikes me, and there is some big work to do, but even as we've discovered on this show and conversations that I'm lucky to have on campus and in the community, is that there are brilliant people working on these problems, right? Brilliant scientists, brilliant solution makers, and you are one of those people, and I just want to thank you for decades of service to the state and to this community. You've had a lasting impact here, and is there anything that you didn't get to that you want to make sure that you plug before we wrap up?
Well, I appreciate what you just said, and I just want people to know that you can make a difference. You really can make a difference, and sometimes these days, with what's going on at the federal level, it seems so overwhelming, and it's really about keeping your eye on the ball, picking something that you can work on and make a difference, and doing it. And it's, we renegotiated our cap and trade. It's now called Cap and Invest, our carbon market last year. And I actually went with some of my colleagues to the New York Climate Week last September because we wanted to explain to other people we are not paralyzed. We are not frozen. We are moving ahead on this. And people treated it so wonderfully. It was like, yes, we want to know this. We want to be able to do it ourselves. And a lot of times in politics, if you allow somebody that's doing bad things or being critical to set the agenda, you're just going to them. And so it's very important to set the agenda yourself, keep the eye on the ball, do it. And that's what we're trying to do at the state right now.
Well, I'm taking stock of that advice, John. So thank you for that. Good luck with the budget today. And thanks for coming on the show.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for this conversation.
All right, that does it for the pod. Thank you, Senator Laird, for coming on the program today. Thank you for your decades of relentless pursuit of environmental solutions. Thank you to Khalida Sarwari, Press Secretary for Senator Laird, for arranging today's conversation. Thank you to Edith Belmont for editing, to Carrie Goodbar for production and distribution. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.